and Dr. Joe Collins. And I just want to, by way of introduction, just a couple words about Sean, a couple words where it fits in, and then we'll turn it over to Joe and Sean as they move forward. So, kind of a neat thing about the College of International Security Affairs is we have this incredible mission, incredible students, and this amazing faculty. And this is a great venue to try to, bring many of those together, but also celebrate the faculty scholarship and how that scholarship isn't going to just go on a shelf, but is actually going to help us think about the contemporary security environment, what we do about this, how do we move forward, because undoubtedly some of you will have that moment today where you go, wow, I hadn't thought of that. And that's a powerful moment because this is a perfect place to think about it now before you encounter it down the street as you go forward. Our last alumni survey at the college, we had 96% of our students said that they maintained contact with their fellow students, but also with their faculty. And 93% of those reported that those contacts helped them combat terrorism in their countries. So that these the relationship's important, but in addition to the personal relationship are the ideas and the exchange of information that come with that, so that they're better enabled, particularly as the security environments change, as they evolve, to help them prepare for that. And I do have to say, I mentioned to Sean earlier, I didn't give him the whole story though. While I was driving to work this morning, one of our previous students flags me down while I'm driving, pull over. You figure it's something like, I left the gas cap open, or, the trunk's flapping or something. And she said, oh, I just wanted to tell you I won't be able to make it to Sean McFate's, book launch. And I was trying to do this, and I'm really excited. And please pass on to him, how incredible that is, and I'm looking forward to the next step. And so, imagine when you have folks years later, they're going to go out of their way, one, to try to extend that, but also how much they value that interaction as it goes forward. So, Sean, no pressure today. Now that we set the bar really high, we're really expecting some great things. I had the privilege a few years ago of team teaching with Sean, which was really fun. Fun for me. I don't know about for him. I think he was kind of tortured by it a little bit. But Sean's here as an associate professor. He had been here previously and then stepped out into the private sector, I think he might call it, and then realized that there's an incredible opportunity here to learn, to grow, maybe not get rich, but still a pretty neat place. You've seen Sean's background, a former paratrooper, but he turned into kind of strategy and defense advisor, jack of all trades, contractor, some great experience in Liberia, rebuilding their army, in Burundi, working with the Presidential Guard, in South Sudan, Eastern Europe, and then kind of a advisor to Amnesty International, something you wouldn't expect from somebody in that kind of line of work. How did you get into this Amnesty International piece? Along the way, he's an adjunct at Georgetown. He's a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. He's an adjunct social scientist at RAND. But, most importantly, he's an incredible member of our CISA team. And Joe Collins is the senior director of the Center for Complex Operations. Joe, truth be told, was my advisor when I was at the National War College. What's that?
That's how old he is.
Well, that's how old I am. But, so it's great to have him here, and he and Sean obviously go back. But please join me in a hearty welcome for both Sean and Joe.
Thanks, Mike.
So thank you, everybody, for coming out today. The weather's kind of spotty, so I respect that. And also, thank you to War on the Rocks. We are podcasting this right now, and this is obviously an unclassified briefing, and these opinions are my own. but hearty welcome to War on the Rocks as well. So I'd like to begin by saying that, 10 years ago, I was sitting in the presidential mansion in Burundi, a small country in Central Africa. And across the table from me, actually across the coffee table from me, was the president, the US ambassador, and another member of the US embassy. And my job was to help prevent a genocide. The US had information that an extremist Hutu group that was hiding in eastern Congo, only 20 kilometers away from the capital of Burundi, Bujumbura, was going to infiltrate at night and try to assassinate the president of Burundi. And hopefully, for them, that would re-trigger the genocide that started in Rwanda in 1994, but swept through the entire region. Now, curiously, I was not a member of the US Armed Forces. I was not a member of the CIA. I worked for a corporation, DynCorp International. And this is increasingly how foreign policy is enacted today, through the private sector. Now, I'm very proud of the work that we did, and I worked closely with members of Burundian military and others, but I didn't think of myself as being, say, a mercenary. Yet, despite that, there's a lot of volumes of ink that have been spilled over the last 10 years about the private military industry. Much of it shrill, either left-wing or right-wing knee-jerk reaction. And part of the reason I wanted to write this book and think deeply about this topic, like going to graduate school, is to put some salience around this debate. The private military industry is extremely opaque, as we will discuss. There's a lot of good things and a lot of bad things, and certainly a lot of myth. So the purpose of this book was to speak as an insider, former insider, about a very opaque industry, about what it can do, what it cannot do, and perhaps its future. That's what the purpose of the book is, and that's why I wrote it. So before we sort of get into the guts of the book, I want to sort of, being a university, have a contractor quiz. So during the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, what percentage of the budget, say 2010, do you think DoD spent on contractors? A is 10%, B, C, goes up to 50%. Any thoughts? What? No, it's not a trick question. 40, 50%? The answer is 50%. 50%. The Department of Defense obligated $366 billion to contracts, which is 7 times the UK Ministry of Defense's entire budget, to put some scope and scale around contracting. How about this? What percentage of US contractors were armed? A, 10%, B, 20%, E, up to 50%. What do you think? E, D, 40%? Okay, we've got everything. The answer is 10%. About 10, not a trick question, just because you got it wrong over there. About 10 to 15% were armed. Most of the contractors did pretty mundane things like cook chow, repair vehicles, build buildings. Then you had some that did translation, interpretation, intel. Only about 10 to 15% in Iraq were actually armed or trained others to be armed. So security, think of Blackwater, and also training. However, don't let the numbers fool you. Even though, well, by the way, this is the focus of the book. The armed and either armed contractors or those who train others to be armed. So those who kill and those who train others to kill. To me, they're in the same moral universe. And I call these private military companies, PMCs. These are expeditionary conflict entrepreneurs that kill or train others to kill. Now in Iraq, again, only 10 to 15%, but again, don't let the numbers fool you. PMC failures have a disproportionate outsized strategic impact. For example, we remember Nisour Square, when Blackwater contractors killed 17 innocent Iraqis at a traffic circle in Baghdad, causing a huge uproar, not just in Iraq, but the entire Middle East, undermining an emerging hearts and minds strategy, to the point where the Secretary of State had to apologize to the region and explain to Congress what is going on. Because who was Blackwater working for? The Department of Defense? State Department. One of the people, sometimes you'll hear that one way to regulate this industry is have, apply the Uniform Code of Military Justice to armed contractors. I'm not sure legally that would work. I think it's more fantasy than reality. But even in the case of Blackwater, that wouldn't have applied because they don't work for DOD, they work for State Department. So armed contractors can have a disproportionate size impact. All right, what percentage of the fatalities in Iraq and Afghanistan were contractor versus troops? A, B, A is 10%, B 25%, 33%, 50%, or more than 50%. C, 33%. More than half towards the end of the war were contractors. Contractors, so here we have in blue are troops, red are contractors. In the beginning of the conflict, troops were taking most of the casualties. Towards the end, contractors were. And these are just the numbers that we know. Companies are not incentivized to share this information. It's like a bank saying we were hacked for $100 million. It's bad for business. Nor does the US federal government have a mechanism to suck this information from the industry. Or if it does, it's hard to verify it. So exact numbers are very hard to come by. Okay, lastly, what percentage of US forces were contracted? A, 10%, 25%, 33%, 50%, more than 50%. What do you think? 50%? E, more than 50%? Anybody say 10%? More than 50% of the force structure in Iraq and Afghanistan was contracted. In Iraq, it's a 1-to-1 ratio. For every trooper, there's a contractor. In Afghanistan, it was 70% towards the end. Here are the numbers. This suggests perhaps a growing dependency by the US government to wage war with contractors. In World War II, only about 10, 12% were contracted. And that was mostly strategic airlift. Over the years, you'll see that there's a growing dependency on the government to do sustained wars on contractors. So why did this happen? How did the US get to a point where it's contracting much of its military force structure abroad? The simple answer, in my opinion, is that in 2002, 2003, policymakers had a set of immaculate assumptions, I would say, that the wars in Iraq, Afghanistan would be very quick. Days, weeks at the most, not months, as Paul Wolfowitz testified in Congress. They did not plan on 2 10-year wars, not the longest wars in US history, as is often misquoted, but they realized quickly, policymakers realized quickly, had terrible policy options in front of them when they realized this was not going to be over quickly. One, they could withdraw from Iraq and Afghanistan prematurely, which would have been seen as defeat and politically infeasible. Two is, let's see if I go up here. Well, let me back up here. First of all, the U.S. Army, the U.S. military could not volunteer enough Americans to serve in the all-volunteer force to sustain these wars. So the solution was they had to choose an option. They would either, again, withdraw prematurely, 2, leave it up to allies to fill all strategic gaps, which didn't seem to be likely or sensible, 3, have a Vietnam-like draft to coerce Americans to fill the billets they could not fill through volunteers, or 4, they could contract out those billets. What do you think they did? They contracted out the difference. So in the beginning of the war, it was never meant that 50% of the force structure in Iraq, Afghanistan would be contracted. It just sort of evolved that way as the military could not volunteer enough people. Now, there are some benefits and there are some risks. And I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. We could discuss it in Q&A. But contrary to a lot of what you read, the industry does some things very good. Sometimes they're cheaper. It's like renting a car versus owning one. Private military force is cheaper. It's a high utility if you can control it. They can do some things better, like stability operations. And there's a lot of other things they can bring too. Private sector innovation, they can tap logistical supply lines that the military can't easily tap. But there's obviously a lot of risks. First and foremost, what happens when you link profit motive with killing? How do you control an industry that can shoot back? You can't arrest them, right? And then we can discuss this in Q&A a little bit, but it creates moral hazard for policymakers. It lowers the barriers of entry into conflict. You can send contractors. Contractors don't count as boots on the ground. Nor does the American public get too upset with dead contractors the way they would do with dead Marines. So if you want to say surge people who can train and equip the Iraqi forces to fight ISIS, and you don't want to say you have 5,000 troops on the ground, boots on the ground, you might put 5,000 contractors in there. So this is a way for policymakers to basically engage in force projection overseas without having to sort of report it as military DoD. All right, I don't want to talk about that, but I do get this question a lot from foreign journalists. Is the U.S. moving to contract warfare? Will we get to a point where future conflicts will be 80% contractors? It's hard to say no to that if you look at the trend lines. I'll leave that for you to think about. I instead want to focus on the future, beyond Afghanistan and beyond Iraq. What's going to happen? In the end of the book, I discuss 4 trends. The first trend is that the industry is not going to evaporate. There are some policymakers, in my opinion, in this city who think of contractors as cheap imitations of infantry units. And that when the war is over, when we don't need them anymore in Afghanistan, they will simply demobilize or go bankrupt. That's a dangerously misguided thought. Contractors will seek new clients. They are profit maximizers. The industry is not going to go away. The U.S.'s use of this industry for 10 years has legitimized it in international relations. So allegedly, Putin is using Chechen mercenaries in the Ukraine. Is the U.S. really going to say outrageous things about that? Or Nigeria, allegedly using mercenaries to whack Boko Haram. Can the U.S. really have a moral authority on this position? No, it really cannot. And it's too late to regulate the industry. The proverbial horse has fled the barn. If you regulate this industry too heavily, it'll simply move offshore. So how do you regulate it? The second trend is the industry is it's going native. So warlords in places like Afghanistan and Somalia turn their militia into a private military company, and they sell their services to oil companies, to humanitarian organizations, and to the U.S. government. In 2010, the U.S. military purchased the services of a warlord to secure convoy routes in the South. So it's not just, we think of banditos as hiring other banditos. The U.S. military has done this as well. Congress did a report actually called Warlords, Inc. on this. And others are just simply imitating the model. So this model is proliferating around the world. At the same time as the industry goes native, it's also becoming more international. So many don't realize it, but well, you have new demands. You have fragile states. You have states who want to defeat Boko Haram, for example. You also have oil extractive industry hiring this industry. You have shipping lines hiring private navies, for example, to go after pirates. You also have, as you've seen recently in Nigeria, you have new supply. Supply is coming from all sorts of places. And most importantly is that security, if you think about political economy, security can generate its own demand. So, in the Middle Ages, when mercenaries were common, they might engage in racketeering. They pull up to a walled city and say, give us 5,000 pounds of gold or we will sack you. And the city coughs up all the gold, and they say, okay, we'll be back next month. Unsupervised mercenaries or unemployed mercenaries can become bandits and predators. Or privateers are basically mercenaries in the sea. They become pirates, like Johnny Depp. So we see a proliferation of private force across all 5 domains of, 4 out of 5 domains of warfare. So the book focuses mostly on land warfare, private military companies and mercenaries, but it also focuses, we also see private navies. You have what they call arsenal ships off the coast of Somalia and the Gulf of Guinea, and these are like ships that are armed, they're like floating arsenals with armed contractors, and if you have a freighter going through pirate waters, they will helicopter armed guards on your ship. They will harden the ship with concertina wire and shoot pirates. Shoot them. And it's called embark security. And then they'll fly back to the arsenal ship. We're starting to see the industry use unarmed drones. These are not like global Predator Hawk, et cetera. These are the type of drones you can just get online. It wouldn't be hard to make kamikaze drones. Obviously, we don't see space flight, armed space flight by private companies, but we're starting to see private companies go to space, like SpaceX. It's possible that in a generation or two we might see, armed private sector spacecraft. And lastly, in the 5th domain of war, cyber, we see cyber mercenaries. They're called hackback companies. So just say, you all recall recently Anthem got hacked. It's an insurance company got hacked. Lost a lot of pretty important data for their clients. So if you're a competitor of Anthem and you don't want to get hacked, what you might want to do is hire illegally a hackback company. These are offshore companies that will attack the hackers that attacked you. They hack back. And they can't get back your information, but they can destroy that hacker maybe. And it acts as a deterrent. So if a hacker is looking at your company and they know you have a hackback company behind you, it might act as a deterrent. You'll pass over that company and go to a different company to hack instead. So these are cyber mercenaries. And lastly, and this is important, is that the industry is bifurcating between 2 different types of armed actors. One is what I call military enterprisers. This is a term that comes from the 30 Years' War. These are people like Wallenstein who actually, they don't deploy private armies, they simply create them for a public sector client or for a client. They work in close public-private partnership to augment their forces or to raise forces to be used, to raise regiments to be used. And this is what the US used in Iraq and Afghanistan. This is like DynCorp, Blackwater, et cetera. These companies are not mercenary companies like Executive Outcomes in the 1990s. Executive Outcomes was a mercenary corporation that came out of South Africa that was a private army. It could do offensive maneuver operations. They had an air force. They had Mi-24 Hind helicopters. And they did work in Angola. They could overthrow governments if they wanted to. They didn't, but they had the capability. Now, in the military enterpriser, that is a mediated market for force because you're working in a public-private context. You're not sort of a free agent as a mercenary is. A mercenary is a free agent in a free market for force. Right now, as we've seen recently in Nigeria, we are teetering on these two markets for force developing simultaneously. And the question is, what will take over? Okay? So what does this mean for the 21st century? What are the implications? Well, first of all, this is not a new phenomenon. Private warriors have been a facet of military history for most of military history. It's actually an anomaly the last couple hundred years that states had a monopoly of force. That's an anomaly historically. And mercenary warfare, particularly in the Middle Ages, that was the norm. Because again, it's cheaper to rent a car than to own one. And everybody, despite what Machiavelli said, who was burned by mercenaries, hence some of his bitterness, hiring a mercenary company to go after, your enemy was no different than hiring a contractor to build your moat or to do your walls. It was like, that's what was done. There's no stigma against it. Some were considered, it was a bloody trade, but it wasn't stigmatized like it is today. They were not called mercenaries back then. They were called condottieri, which means contractor. And they formed multinational corporations like they do today. This is not a new phenomenon. Now, this began to, over the 17th, 18th, 19th century, states began to monopolize force as a category of actor. And then they stigmatized mercenaries because mercenaries could actually threaten the state physically. They literally monopolized the market for force. And now this idea that only states should have a legitimate monopoly of force is actually historical fiction. It's a reification of a 19th century norm reified in 20th century political science literature. So what does this mean? That we're seeing a reemergence of private security forces, private military forces in the 21st century. It means that we're reverting back to the status quo ante of a different world order, the one that preceded the Westphalian order, the state-centric order, to a time of what I call sort of the Middle Ages as a metaphor, where states did not have a monopoly of force. So let me explain. Here's a timeline for the historians out there who like these things. So back in, say, Europe, looking at Europe, this is not a European phenomenon today. We had a medieval order. The primary actors, it was a free-for-all. There were states today now are the primary actors, but back then, anybody who had money, et cetera, power, could hire mercenaries. They could also use knights. So knights and mercenaries are how you enforced your rule of law. And rich families did this. City-states like Florence did this. The Pope did this. Kings did this. This was common. This is how you fought wars. Very few people, if anybody, had a standing army. It was simply too expensive. Arguably, the King of France did. That was kind of it in Spain. Now, around 1650, around there, we start to see this shift. And this is after the 30 Years' War. 1640 is the Peace of Westphalia. Mercenaries were devastating during the 30 Years' War, and many got together, and there's other reasons as well, technology, innovations, political structures, that we started to see states consolidate power, that they became the primary actor in international relations, and only their national armies, their standing armies, could legitimately wage war, and everybody else was outlawed, literally outlawed. They used military enterprisers, though. But recently, in the last 25 years, we've started to see the Westphalian order erode. So earlier on in the 1990s with globalization and the rise of international organizations and NGOs, and of course armed non-state actors. And lastly, the existence of private military force. Now, I don't get too deep into this, but in the book I use the theory of Hedley Bull, an English school international relations theorist, where he explores the categories of neo-medievalism, and in his time in 1977, he didn't find evidence for it. That was a very state-centric Westphalian time. We are now in a different era, and I sort of reevaluate, using his framework, what that looks like, and find a lot of evidence for it. The only question now is, which of these two actors will dominate, mercenaries or military enterprisers? So I call this sort of emerging order neo-medievalism. It is a non-state-centric world order with overlapping authorities and allegiances, just like the Middle Ages. So in the Middle Ages, if you were like some peasant on a piece of farmland, you had to answer to a prince, but also to perhaps an abbot, to a king, but also to a bishop. and to an emperor and also to a pope, who all had competing claims over you. And you see this sort of today about politics identity. Are you, what are you? Are you an Afghani? Are you a Pashtu? Are you from this district or village? You have different sort of levels of identity. So the first thing what this world might look like is what I call durable disorder. It's a system that can contain but not resolve problems. Durable disorder. And you might say, arguably, we're seeing this today in Iraq. Second, you're starting to see the commodification of conflict. We're already seeing this with mercenaries and private military enterprisers. But anybody who has the means to wage war, who can afford the means of war, can wage it for whatever reason they want. It doesn't have to be political. It could be vengeance. It could be to steal things. I want that copper mine. I'm going to take it. This will create new powers where the super rich or big multinational corporations could become a new type of superpower in the 21st century. Can you imagine ExxonMobil with its own military? Or an oligarch? And this will encourage the rise of mercenaries. Now, right now, people are looking at Nigeria, and they're looking at what kind of international rage or outrage will this produce. And so far, we're seeing very little. So people are thinking, well, what if we use it against Al-Shabaab? Or how about ISIS? Can we use it against ISIS? So this is a free market for force. And again, we're the precipice between enterprisers and mercenaries. And lastly, we'll resurrect a new type of warfare, contract warfare, like contract killing but for war. So this was, again, how, when you privatize war, it changes warfare. And this is a type of war we saw a lot in the Middle Ages. And it responds to the logic of the marketplace. So you have strategies of the marketplace that can impact you that you don't see in national armies or CrossFits. So for example, just say I am Florence, a city-state in Italy, and I want to attack Pisa, a smaller rival city-state. Before I begin my attack, one thing I might do is I will buy up all the mercenaries in North Italy. So that will deny Pisa a defense. But what Pisa can do is they will secretly bribe my mercenaries not to show up for battle day, which is what happened in 1502, when Machiavelli was in the Ministry of Defense, if you will, of Florence, and he got really bitter about this, and he was fired. Florence was defeated, and he wrote his invectives against the mercenary trade in The Prince, which we all read. But his was a minority opinion. We forget that. And mercenaries were quite effective. They were quite bloody and terrible, too. I'm not making a case for them, but they were good at some of what they did. And lastly, a world with an industry that's invested in conflict will create more war for itself. So this industry will mean there will be more war in the future. Not big wars like World War II or World War III, although they can create wars that suck in other powers. That could happen. But you'll have an industry invested in conflict that has, we've seen this historically, I'm not sure about today, that can create and start its own wars. It can elongate wars for profit and expand them. So that's sort of the book, what it covers. And with that, I will turn it over to Joe. Thank you. Thank you very much.
I'm Joe Collins from the Center for Complex Operations. It's a very small outfit, but we do irregular warfare issues, unity of effort considerations, and we also work on lessons learned projects. Years ago, when Sean mentioned this book to me and what he was going to do, I thought we were going to get a book that was sort of inside DynCorp and all of its competitors, which actually for me was interesting, but not for many other people. Your book is a lot more interesting than that. It's almost a new theory of international relations, the politics of neo-medievalism. Was that your intent, Sean? Or what are the ramifications of that for the United States? Does the United States win more than other countries, or are we going to be the big loser?
Well, when I started the book, there have been countless books on Blackwater in Iraq. And there's been countless books on the fraud, waste, and abuse of contractors. I wanted to write a three-dimensional book that was worth reading, frankly. And I wanted to see what happens if you privatize war, how does it change warfare and implications for world order? And so that was sort of the genesis of it. But also, actually the book is really not about mercenaries. It's actually about the changing nature of the 21st century world order. And I use mercenaries as sort of a backdoor way to explain this and show that this phenomenon is occurring, the sort of durable disorder. If you look at the Middle East right now, you look at much of Africa, South Asia, that seems to hold true.
Great. Maybe we should make a virtue of necessity. There are two great force deployers in the world, the United States and the United Nations. The UN has about 120,000 peacekeepers deployed all over the world, with Africa taking up most of them. Why shouldn't we outsource, and the we here includes the United States and the UN, why shouldn't we outsource lesser missions or routine training missions to the private military companies? If we want to take it a step further, we could make it like the Roman tax collectors. We could make the PMCs collect their own fees from the host entity. Just kidding on that last one, but could that possibly be a way around the shortage of peacekeepers for Africa?
Well, for the U.S., I don't see the U.S. ever using mercenaries because the U.S. has its own very strong military. But the U.S. military, in my opinion, is a military of assault and not occupation. And sort of the training skills, the stability ops skills, is stuff that the industry can do very well. And I think that can certainly be outsourced, and I would be curious to know if we're starting to look at the industry to sort of do training and equipping of the Iraqi forces. But in the end of the book, I do propose that the UN consider using this industry to augment thinning peacekeeping missions around the world. Every year, there's more demand. There are blue helmets to fill them. And I think and also in the end of the book, I'm very skeptical about trying to regulate this industry. I don't think you can. There's a lot of efforts. We can discuss those efforts, but ultimately, I don't think you can regulate the industry. But what you can do is you can shape its behavior using market power. So if you're like the chief consumer, you can say, here's our standards, and if you meet these standards, we will reward you with lucrative contracts. If you don't, then we will never hire you, and you'll probably go out of business. It's like Walmart when they say, I want a T-shirt made. You please the customer because they're the biggest customer in the world. The UN has the ability to do that. And I think there's a strong argument to be made that the UN, if it has a proper licensing and registration scheme with proper vetting and transparency and human rights norms, could use the military enterprise as a force for good.
Sean, that brings up the law of warfare, and you touched on it in your presentation. There are lots of protocols to the Geneva Conventions, which the United States hasn't yet gotten around to sort of validating. But do we need a new one on contractors at war?
Yeah, so there is no Geneva Protocol on armed civilians in the battle space. And so we don't know how to even apply the laws of war to this industry. There is some, there are some examples where the UN has said, like, these are mercenary companies, and they should be treated as such, but they've been largely ignored. In 2009, there was a UN committee on this. But I don't think that, even if you had such a protocol, it'd be very difficult to enforce. And lastly, the laws of war really are a Westphalian concept. They regulate interstate warfare, and they don't regulate like armed non-state actor warfare. And so that's the bigger question: is how do we even go about reconceiving laws of war that would deal with armed non-state actors, of which this is one example.
Sean, let's take this out beyond the last chapter in your book, a few decades. Does the outsourcing of military tasks continue to grow? Do contractors and PMCs continue to proliferate? Or will there be a point, like there was between France and Italy in the day of the Condottieri, where the states counterattack and take back the high ground of armed combat and intelligence work?
So in my opinion, there will not be a point where the states sort of do that. If you look at the 190, 194 states in the world, most of them are fragile or conflict affected. I don't see the majority of states sort of unilaterally doing this. I don't see the UN leading that charge, although some have said the UN should have its own contracted army. But I see this trend growing because there's really nothing else to stop it. So in some ways, I think that the 21st century will look more like the 12th century than the 20th.
That's a good place to stop, and all the interesting questions are out there. I know it. And we have some folks, and we'll go first to Ken, and then Bernie, and then Mike.
Well, let's get the mic as we're podcasting this, so thank you, Ken.
The contractors that we put in my business, we put into harm's way, are insured for liability with the U.S. government. Is someone like Dynacor or anyone else, if people get killed, is Dynacor liable if somebody sues them? Because I know in my business, the contractors will not go unless they are covered by liability by the U.S. government, and we give them that. So I just wondered how it works with Dynacor and others.
Well, I'm not a lawyer, and I don't, and I can't speak to Dynacor specifically, but I think in general, if you get killed in a war zone, insurance doesn't cover it. It's considered an act of terrorism. And most insurance does not, unless you're doing Lloyd's of London, which a lowly contractor would never be having doing that. There's something called defense-based DBA, defense-based allowance insurance, that is like a minimal insurance that the U.S. provides contractors. But we can't forget two things. One is that most of the individuals in this industry are not American. So Dynacor and these other companies, they have American faces and American headquarters, but these are multinational corporations, and the majority of their individuals, their workers, are from all over the world. So when I was in Dynacor, I was sitting next to people from Mexico, from Cote d'Ivoire, from whomever, from all around the world. And we also have to think, what happens to those people when the contract is over? They go home. And some of them might start their own private military company, and we're starting to see that actually.
Okay, Bernie in the back.
Hi, Sean. I have to think more about your thesis about how this is turning into a brave new world. I'm not sure that I see it that way. It strikes me that today's world is very different from the Middle Ages. But what I wanted to ask you, I looked at this issue a few years ago, and one of the conclusions that I drew was that one of the main problems we were having, well, it's a principal agent problem. I mean, when all is said and done, the companies are hired by the U.S. military. And as you say, they're international, but most of the managers and the people who run, they're all former military themselves. That's where they get the training from. But the main problem that I found was that, as you say, the scandals that occurred were happened with contractors that were employed by the State Department. But DOD also employs contractors, where the management and the oversight is much more rigorous, of course, because the contractor, and no contractor wants to work, by the way, for the military, because the commander is breathing down their neck, knows everything they're going to do before they do it, and understands, how they've been trained. Whereas the State Department, of course, has no such background. So I always make the analogy, it would be like me hiring somebody to build a bridge. I don't know anything about building a bridge. So I wondered did you address this issue of the principal agent and whether, this is really, it's a management issue. It's a question for the U.S. government. Who manages the contractors? There's all kinds of questions out there. Even if State Department does hire them, should they be reporting to the ground commander? Do they need oversight by someone who actually knows what they're doing and what types of training that they have?
So this is a great question. So going back to the Middle Ages, I do address principal agent issues a lot in the book. And this is a principal agent problem. And this was a principal agent problem in the Middle Ages as well. So if, say, a city-state or a aristocratic family was to hire a mercenary company, they would send with it a person who was to be the oversight person. They were not part of the mercenary company. There's a name for it. And the equivalent of that today is something called a contractor officer's technical representative, a COTR. And that COTR is supposed to be that expert, that subject matter expert, who's supposed to oversee it in the US government. But the problem, of course, is they often don't have the background or knowledge to do it. And that's because this industry, because of Iraq and Afghanistan, it blew up more quickly, it grew more quickly than the bureaucracy could grow with it. And in 2004, 2005, there was something called a Gansler report from Colonel Dr. Gansler. That sort of identified all these issues early and said we need to train company-level officers how to run contracts. And of course, all these points were pretty much lost. But he got it right. They got it right 10 years ago. And we still don't do that. And I think partly, in my opinion, it's because the attitude about contractors is we're going to be out of this conflict next year anyway. It's sort of like Paul Van's talk about Vietnam War.
Okay, Mike, you're up next.
Hi, so I'm Mike Bell from the College of International Security Affairs. Thank you, Sean, Joe. Hey, to maybe rip a little bit off of Bernie's comments, but it seems to me that let me set it up and then you can respond. But it seems to me that we have a whole bunch of armed folks out there that we traditionally don't even consider contractors. And even in your quiz beforehand, you left them out. And the implications for their functions on the battlefield are actually pretty long term. And the example I'm thinking of are the SAWA, the Sons of Iraq, 128,000 paid for by the US government, armed, performing local security functions, aka combat. But of course, when we do our tally of contractors in Iraq, we don't consider that 128,000 folks. Now, there were promises that they'd be transitioned to the Iraqi security forces or given training, most of which didn't happen. So over time, 128,000 disgruntled guys is a different phenomenon. But so could you talk about the surrogates, the proxies, the others out there that really don't fit our categories, but in the end are probably wearing some type of American-provided uniform or paid for by the U.S. government, maybe by SERP funds or something. But how do you see that phenomenon?
Well, I'm really glad that you asked this question. So the book does not address, proxies that are made by powers like the United States, which is, common, right? And arguably they should be included. And I think that would be a further research because that's different than a sort of a corporate model. But certainly, the U.S. does create proxies. And it's hard to sort of look to Putin and say, you can't use your proxies in eastern Ukraine. I mean, that's illegal. That's bad when we're quite proficient at it. And proxy warfare is quite an old form of warfare. We see this a lot in South Asia. We see a lot in the Great Lakes, right? M23, for example, in the Great Lakes region. So, and this is something, ironically, that contractors do very well. It's the contractors creating sort of training other contractors. If it was Star Wars, it'd be like droids building droids, right? But this is a deep concern and needs further research, in my opinion.
Neo-contractors in the neo-medieval world. It's Jay Parker's next book. In the back there. No, the two rows up. Thank you.
I'm not quite as distinguished as Dr. Parker, but the question I have is to the other side of this equation, which was not in the presentation. Perhaps it's in the book, but in any case, it would be wonderful to hear your comments on it, which is, we've talked about what happens when the United States hires mercenaries or contractors. What happens when a group like ISIS starts hiring them?
So this is the big fear. So the U.S.'s use of this industry has legitimized its use. It's also made an industry to be used, a new tool or a new piece on the chessboard. So I'm not so sure ISIS would do it. They could, but they're very ideologically driven. I'm worried about drug cartels, right? Because one of the things that we see, and I do talk about this in the book, one of the utilities of the industry is they bring specialized, abilities. So, the U.S. doesn't need this. We don't need any. We have like Delta Force, we have everything else. We don't need anything. But if you're a drug cartel and you just need to borrow, you want to rent some, Mi-24 Hind helicopters for a month to wipe out a rival cartel and take over their turf, contractors could do that, right? Where you don't want to have to buy and maintain Hind helicopters, because that's a very expensive line item. So contractors have a great private utility there, and this is indeed a concern. Also, we're just so you know, this industry is, we keep on thinking of this as a U.S. industry. We keep on thinking as Afghanistan and Iraq. That is over. That's very 2007. We're starting to see thousands of ex-special forces from Latin America show up in Abu Dhabi. We're starting to see, soldiers from ex-former Soviet republics showing up in Nigeria. Former executive, this industry is all over the world right now. And it's not just something this is not like a retrospective of the U.S.'s use of them. The U.S. has created an industry, and I'm interested to see who else is using this industry and how it's going to proliferate.
And Jay Parker, finally.
Yeah, if I'm going to be blamed for asking a question, maybe I should ask one. Sean, first of all, congratulations on the book and some really tremendous insights here. You've talked about, and I think many of us are familiar with, the number of examples where tactical actions by contractors constrain, in some cases, have literally derailed strategic choices and strategic control by states. To date, most of those examples seem to be serendipitous or accidental. Do you foresee, or are you aware of instances where, as this market power grows, where these firms take action that deliberately directs, for their corporate advantage, the strategic choices or the strategic options by states?
I think one of the questions is what's going to happen to the mercenaries hired by Nigeria after Nigeria is done with them. Right? Where are they going to go? And if they're unemployed for a long time, will they try to make employment? And again, security is a commodity that can generate its own demand. But let me tell you a story. So in 2008, I was approached by an NGO, a human rights NGO, and it was approached by a very wealthy actress. And what she wanted to do was hire Blackwater to stage a humanitarian intervention in Darfur, and then have an NGO sort of name and shame the international community into a real UN peacekeeping mission. Because at that point, there's never really been a real UN peacekeeping mission in Darfur, in my opinion. And the NGO came to me pro bono and said, they asked me two questions. One, could Blackwater actually do this? And two, is this a good idea? And so one, because I had looked at this when I was in DynCorp, actually, and we decided it wasn't worth it because we couldn't get a buyer. We couldn't get the U.S. government to do it. And Darfur is like trying to resupply the other side of the moon. It's logistically a nightmare. But to answer the question, one is that Blackwater actually could do this. They had a sub-company called Greystone that was built for this. It was an offensive, basically an infantry sort of special ops unit, and that they would go in and they'd create islands of humanity, and they would save Darfurian civilians and keep out the Janjaweed, the genocideers, and then hold that territory for days or weeks as the NGO was then going to go and name and shame the international community. But then we talked it through and wow, what would it be like, if the Blackwater guards were hauled in front of the International Criminal Court, along with President Bashir, who also had an arrest warrant, president of Sudan, for starting the genocide and then for trying to prevent it. Here we have also one with several armed non-state actors working together to do an invasion in a state to try to get the UN, another non-state actor, involved as well? And could this suck the US into a war in Sudan? So all these questions happen, and all the players at that table said, no, we're not going to, this is too much for the international community. That was 2008. It's going to happen. Some oligarch, some really rich person who wants to make a legacy or something is going to do something like that. And they're not going to hire Blackwater, which was then concerned about its relationship with the US government. They're going to hire something out of, I don't know, Ukraine or someplace like that, and, or what's going on right now in Nigeria. And I think that can create the scenario you've described.
Just a note on the previous question about illicit networks and the example of ISIS hiring contractors. We've had a group in CCO studying what they call convergence, the networking of illicit networks. Their first book was in 2012. They've got another one coming out this year after their conference. I'd like to ask the next question, Sean. Based on what you just said, do you think it's possible an outfit like Blackwater or Greystone could actually be used to build mobilization units for the U.S. Army? For example, could Blackwater raise a competent infantry battalion faster than the American National Guard?
That's a great question. They certainly have the facilities for it. They have some of the best facilities around. I think it's possible if they had a contract to do so, they would do that. They could do that very well. The question is, would it create like a French Foreign Legion? So people say, well, French Foreign Legion is mercenary. Actually, it's not. The French Foreign Legion is part of the French military. It just has enlisted, can be from anybody in the world. And so could there be an American Foreign Legion that is trained and managed by a private military company, but with people from around the world? The answer is yes, I think.
Yeah, and along the same line, probably be even easier for them to do something like, civil response corps.
Right, and they can, one thing that contractors do very well, or they can do pretty well, is stability operations. And they could do they could surge. When I was in the industry, if we needed, if I needed a specialist in certain type of UN law or something, I could go out and reach somebody and find that person for 3 weeks and hire them, and then they go home. It's really hard to do that in the bureaucracy, right? So this is part of the surge capacity. And I think if you want to do it, I think also one reason the Civilian Response Corps never took off is because we have a Civilian Response Corps, and it's called Contractors.
Interesting. Down in the front here. And then this lady over here.
Hi, Sean. Thank you so much. Colin Jones from Booz Allen Hamilton. My question is, you broke the PMCs into the two categories, and you talked about the profit motive that drives them. I think my question is, what do you foresee happens when either a military enterprise or a mercenary decides that its ideological motives now outweigh its profit motives, and how do you see that interacting with sort of the more transnational and globalized world?
Right. Well, certainly, if you look at the motivations for why people fight, there's always some combination of ideology as well as material recompense, unless you're a pure fanatic or you're a pure mercenary. So it's a gray area, and certainly the U.S. Army does this. We have huge enlistment bonuses, and we need to fill the ranks, right? The U.S. Army is not purely political either, and certainly there's a lot of contractors that I work with who would never, if the company they were working in decided to work for like China in Africa, they would say, no, thank you, I don't want to do that. So I think that the distinguish between, and to get back to your question, I think if a private military company decides it's more politically motivated than profit, then maybe it's going to enter the world of NGO status, nonprofit status, because you're ideologically motivated, you don't really care as much about the profit margins. But I think there can be ideologically motivated mercenary corporations, and you look at some of the people who served in the Spanish Civil War were also similarly kind of like that as well.
Lady down front here.
Thank you, Sean. So that was more or less my question, whether or not you think that the ideological dimension of conflict puts a natural brake on the expansion of the private contractor world. But you've addressed that to a certain extent. I don't know if you'd like to say more about it. I also wanted to know if, so with globalization and the rise of the multinational corporation, and what a lot of people observed was that states didn't have control over their borders like they used to. And that was this major thing that made people predict a new world order. And now you're saying states don't have control of force like they used to, and that's creating a new world order. What do you think the chances are that, so now we look at globalization and we see MNCs, but we also think that states actually do end up having the monopoly over control over their borders, goods that come in and out. It's sort of like both things coexist. So what do you think the prospects are for this as well, that yes, states don't have that degree of monopoly of force anymore, but they can coexist in the world order with contractors?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I talk a lot about globalization, and globalization is part of this industry's story, right? This industry is what started, happening, a decade or two ago. This industry is the latest sort of development of that. This is not an alternate, interpretation. And I talk about how, I look at the literature on globalization from the 1990s and how it erodes states' power. I would say two things. I mean, states today are more like counties in the United States of America. They're in charge of the bridges, they're in charge of certain civic administration, but they really don't have, the control that we'd like to think that they do over their territory. People come through and they leave, they don't, it's very porous. Most of the states in the world today, like look at much of Africa or South Asia, it's very porous. And state authority doesn't extend very far beyond the capital of a lot of states. And security is not actually a public good. You have like regime security, and it becomes, I've talked about this with Dr. Thompson, a club good in political economy, where it's extended only to those who are of a certain ethnic group who occupy the ruler's mansion or something. So I really don't think, I think the era of strong states is past. The idea of like the UN doing, interventions in states against their will is an example of this. I think that, I think that the emergence, the private military industry would not emerge if states were strong, frankly. So that's how I look at it, at least.
Over here.
Hi, Sean. Laura Engelbrecht, president of Atlantean, which is a small company that probably falls into one of these nefarious categories, but working for DoD and the UN throughout the world, but most recently in Somalia. If you'll allow me a quick comment, technical comment, and then a question. The technical comment was about the insurance and liability question, and I would just note that in the last couple of years, we've seen an evolution in the last decade, so that almost every single contract statement of work that's coming out of DoD or State Department is requiring the purchase of Defense-Based Act insurance for not only U.S. citizens, but also for third country nationals and local nationals, unless the country you're working in has a workers' comp type regime that would replace that. And so that actually adds challenges for hiring local nationals like in Somalia and other places. But actually the insurance and liability is an interesting way that the U.S. government could, if they got themselves organized, could track injuries and fatalities through the, because pretty much every company, while they're not going to put on their website that they lost X number of people, they're going to file those claims and get those insurance monies for that. So that's the comment. The question is, basically, if I follow the line of the train of thought, what defines a mercenary as opposed to sort of a fanatic or a insurgent would be that profit motive. And there's the fear that that would grow in the future to the extent where they would look for clients other than the nation state. I was wondering if you could comment, though, on the fact that you started with the statistic of the $330 billion in 2010. As an industry, you always want to keep your largest client happy. And I have never encountered a company in the industry, including non-U.S. companies, that would cross their largest client. So what do you think is the replacement client that you fear? You mentioned the drug cartels, but those seem to be one-off things. In terms of sustained funding and things to the tune of billions rather than millions, it really seems that the U.S. government is the largest client. And I don't know of a single company, maybe you ran across it in your research, but are there players that are really fearful that would do anything that wouldn't please the U.S. government?
Oh, sure. I mean, the era of the U.S. government and this industry, that chapter is closed. The industry is now proliferated. It's now a free market. It's going to become a free market for force. So right in the decade of war, in this industry, there was something called a monospony, when you have one client as the consumer in chief. And as such, they have great market power to dictate norms of the industry, best practices, which the U.S. failed to do, frankly, for different reasons. But now there is no such thing. I mean, the UN could do it if Department of Peacekeeping Operations decided to do it, but that's a very big debate. Slowly, the UN's turning to contractors. The question is, will they turn to armed contractors? So that remains to be seen. What we do see happening is extractive industries hiring this industry. Private military, like oil companies, gas companies, mining companies are hiring triple canopy, et cetera, to protect their people because they can't rely on local government, military, or police to do it. We're starting to see NGOs, like Save the Children, I think, hiring them to protect people, places, and things. We'll start to see, states like Nigeria. We're starting to see also states like Russia use this industry to attack other states. So I think we're already seeing it proliferate. And the idea, I think we need to really, part of the book is to sort of kickstart our thinking about, okay, the chapter after the U.S., what's that going to look like? Those who still work for the U.S., the U.S. is still going to be a player. The question is, what's going to happen in Afghanistan after the U.S. leaves? That will become a big marketing opportunity for this industry. And there's some concern about that, too.
Okay. Lady with the white shirt.
Thank you. Fascinating book. So, follow up to two previous questions. Mercenaries versus the state. I wonder, and I teach that in my terrorism and crime class, that non-state actors, violent non-state actors who are interested in profit are not really interested in overthrowing the state. They need some sort of political authority to control the monetary system, to keep the society in order, to provide education, infrastructure. Do you think that this is also the case with mercenaries, that in the end, they want the political authority, be that local, regional, or international? What we're going to see is not so much the retreat of the state, but the existence or coexistence, as Ramiz pointed out, of the state along with those mercenaries, and actually evolution of regulations. Thanks.
I'm not sure I agree with the fact that the industry longs for political authorities. I think that looking back historically, again, where contract war is prevalent, like in the European Middle Ages, the industry, mercenaries would co-opt the state, just as narcos have co-opted states. They certainly need global finance. They need some of the institutions of a state, but their idea of good rule of law, as long as it benefits them. And sometimes historically they would take over a state. So Sforza was a mercenary captain who took over Milan, basically. It was easier that way, right? And there were sort of aristocratic families, quote unquote, that were set up. The initial founder was a mercenary who defeated the state and sort of took over the throne. So I can see a world where some of them, I think certainly enterprisers want that, and they want regulation, and they want a market that they can compete advantageously, and but I can also see mercenaries not caring at all really about that. So again, we're at this precipice between enterprisers and mercenaries, and I think the latter category wouldn't care, the former would.
In the center there.
Hi, Jim Mancini, CISA. We've talked a lot about the UN, and we see it as basically starting to become another major consumer of this product. And we're also seeing several states that are basically become the go-to provider of UN forces, such that their sole existence of militaries in some of these places is just to provide for the UN. Training facilities are built. So at one point do states start being driven by the consumer aspect of this and the profit margin in this? Why have, if there's no threat to the state other than providing that military to the UN, where's that blurring in the mercenary aspect of it, and when are they state mercenaries to a certain extent?
Well, so the states that are donor, like troop contributors to the UN, arguably depend on the UN to fund its force modification, right, and modernization. And so if you look at, I'm not going to say the states, but there's, they probably would not like to see the UN turn to a private military industry for their own needs and interests. And arguably, their interest in the UN, it might be driven by political interests, but it's also driven by, I would argue, transactional interests as well. And so, that is, you could argue that. And, also, as this, historically, as the states, as a category of political actor in history, monopolized force, they outlawed independent mercenaries, but they allowed other states to have rental regiments, right? Like, you could rent our army, King George III, to put down your insurrection in those pesky colonies. But, you could not go on a free market and hire bands of mercenaries like you could in the 30 Years' War. So over time, you started to see states monopolize in sort of a hybrid manner, and my argument in the book is we're just sort of devolving. We're just sort of going back to status quo ante to the Middle Ages.
Okay, Professor Abbas had his hand up.
Congratulations, Sean, again for this excellent book. My question is about, you've talked about private armies. We also know that in the intelligence world, there's this phenomena where some of this work is given to private intel groups. How do you compare, or whether you have in the book, or if not, can you briefly speak about the comparison between private intelligence mercenaries and private army mercenaries?
So I do talk briefly about private intelligence firms in the book. That's not the focus of the book, but intelligence is also being privatized. Now, I'm not talking about analysis, like Booz Allen Hamilton does a lot of analysis. That's not what I'm talking about, collection, because, and we're starting to see that. Now, Blackwater had collected in Baghdad, and not just for themselves, for clients. And all the principal agent issues, all the complications that sort of trouble and challenge the world of private militaries also works there. So, for example, are they incentivized to collect information that can elongate and expand their contract versus information that the commanders put out as his true needs or her true needs? So that is an issue. But we're also seeing this expansion in the private intelligence industry as well.
And there's a rise of an awful lot of hybrid actors, people who are doing everything, and organizations that are thought of, well, this is a terrorist organization. You find them engaged in organized crime, you find them engaged in trafficking in women and drugs, and in order to become self-financing. And all of the Iranian-backed groups, to a large degree, have a very high entrepreneurial factor in how they're actually being organized. We had one more question here. Sir.
Hi, Sean. Will Peace from Lockheed Martin. A lot of the discussion, or most of the discussion today, surrounding kinetic. But I wondered about the cyber aspect. So on the kinetic front, essentially, you're saying, hey, horses left the barn. It's left to us to wrap our minds with, or wrap our minds around how to deal with that. Same way with the cyber aspect, because it almost seems that for U.S. interests, the cyber aspect could be more at risk, at threat than the kinetic. And I wondered if you could elaborate on that.
So the cyber aspect is very interesting. First of all, I'm not trying to say that the same companies that engage in private military, land forces are also engaging in cyber. There's a different set of companies that are doing it. But right now on the books, in the US law, it's illegal for companies who get hacked to like hack back. So if you're like Walmart, you can only play defense, you can't play offense. And this has caused a lot of consternation in the business community because they're like, well, who's supposed to protect us? So it's a classic social contract with the government. Like, you obey the government's rules if they, for example, protect you and give you security. Well, what happens when the government's not doing that? When the NSA can't or won't protect every American company out there, and they're just tired of being, they don't want to see their entire company blow up because Chinese and Russian hackers. And you're already starting to see this where if you have an oil company doing business in Africa and they're negotiating against a Chinese firm, the Chinese firm will magically know what their bid will be, because a lot of countries like China, corporate espionage, commercial espionage is fair game, whereas the U.S. doesn't do that. So we don't, so a lot of the companies are turning or thinking, publicly talking about, well, we want to use hackback companies, offshore hackback companies. And all these debates, it's happening right now. Like, will this suck the U.S. into a cyber war? Especially with the question of attribution, right? And I can imagine a world where, how many more Anthems or Target company, like the CEO of Target fired for hacking, how many more of those will happen before the business community says, we don't care anymore, U.S. government, we're going to make it happen either way. So I think cyber is a huge area, and the logic that permeates this market in the book extends to the cyber realm without any problem. It's the same machinations. It's just a different type of means to do it.
Go ahead, Ken.
In the military.
All right, we'll just wait for sorry, Ken.
In the military, you sign an oath that if you become a POW, you give your name, your rank, your serial number. That's it.
Mm-hmm.
You don't give any classified.
Mm-hmm.
And you sign that. Now, civilians some civilian contractors have security clearances. What is the rule for civilian contractors if they become a prisoner? Can they give anything they want? Will they give out classified if they start getting beaten up? There's a problem here, and the other problem, Sean, I see, what's going to drive the contractors is a budget. One president comes in, he thinks we've got to go with contractors on everything. Another president come in, forget the contractors, let's go another way. So I see this thing swinging. Yeah. Also, because I can name presidents that didn't like contractors. I name presidents that did like contractors. And what is the cheapest? So the budget's going to drive a lot of this that I see on how it goes. When you get down where the rubber hits the road, and also when you get down to POWs, what's the rule for people that's got the same clearances that I have, for an example, that wear a suit and I wear a uniform?
Well, answering the POW question, the only rules they're obliged to honor are the ones that are written into the contract, right? In general, presidents, if we're thinking about a U.S.-only phenomenon, it'll come and go, but it's interesting to see, like, for example, Senator Obama suggested legislation on this industry that President Obama really hasn't done much about. So, where you stand depends on where you sit, maybe, Miles' law. But I think writ large, there's another interesting aspect to this, is how does a private warrior ethos challenge a public warrior ethos? And this was an ancient problem back in the Middle Ages between knights and mercenaries who detested each other. And the reason is simple, is that when you're an officer in the U.S. Army, as I was, you take an oath. You don't work for the Army, you serve in the Army. You fight for the nation, what it stands for, and you're prepared to die. And if you're died, the nation will recognize you as a hero. Contractors take this and they flip it on its head by making that into a pure transaction. And this is a constant, and you see this, most military contractors come from a military someplace, and they're old pals say I was accused of, you've gone dark, you went to the dark side, you went Merc on us, like you're scum of the earth. And because it's really butting against the warrior ethos that pervades not just militaries, but also makes soldiers fight and die. And it's a deep offense to that.
Well, Sean, thank you. You said your objective was to kickstart our thinking, and you've certainly done that, and all the way from talking about private military companies to neo-medievalism and theories of international relations, and we owe you a great debt of gratitude, and everybody run out and buy this book.
Thanks.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
So if Joe could say you could run out and buy the book, he would have said that. So I want to, I got to say two things. One, if you didn't know, the College of International Security Affairs is authorized to have industry fellows.
Uh-huh.
And so maybe we need to think differently about the industry fellows that we could have in our student populations based on Sean's work. On a much more important one, I want to say thank you to Sean, and I want to say thank you to Joe. So first to Sean, you've earned the CISA coin.
Thank you.
And Joe,
Thank you, sir.
For soldiering on.
I will put this in a place of honor.
Let's give him a round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you,
There you go,
Joe.
bud.
Really appreciate
Great
that.
job.
Thank you.